So we're going to roll up our sleeves and dive into the CAPP guidelines. Just a quick couple notes on how we're going to go through this so you understand the flow here. We're going to be going through the guidelines section by section and even page by page. So as we go through this, don't bother writing down any links or anything like that. You're going to get a follow-up email after this session, links to this presentation, links to the CAPP guidelines themselves, and a couple other things. So yeah, don't worry too much about taking really diligent notes. Thought we'd save a couple trees and not hand out a 50-page document to everybody. So yes, be sure to download this presentation when you get back to the office. And just note also, as you read through the regs on your own after this session, which I would recommend, have this presentation on hand just because, again, we're making reference to a specific sections, specific pages. So as you're reading through that, oh, what did Andy say about this one? That sort of thing, right? Okay. So getting into the introduction of the guidelines, pretty standard, basic introductory discussion here, but there were a couple of elements that I did want to touch on. This statement here, regulators in Western Canada mandate the preparation of an H2S release rate before an application is submitted. In a past meeting that I had with the ERCB, just trying to get a little bit of feedback as to if you're slapping the hands of a potential operator, why would you be, what are the issues that you're often finding in some of these audits? And they did mention this a couple of times, is that the work is not being done before the license has been submitted. There's evidence that even, not only are they doing the release rate assessment after the license, but it's even after the well's been drilled. And in some cases, even quite evident that they're doing the release rate upon an audit notification. So just a reminder to everybody, it is important to be doing this work ahead of time. In the introduction, they get into a little bit of a review on the changes to the guidelines. I'm not going to get into every single one of them, but there were a few that I did want to focus on. The removal of the maps. For those who are familiar with the original CAPP guidelines, they had laid out I think it was called the Exclusion Maps. But what it was basically designed to do is allow the analyst to identify low-risk geologic and geographic areas based on H2S. And they were using the guideline of about 500 parts per million. If it's less than 500 parts per million in a certain area, you can just simply knock out that entire geologic area. It was actually a really handy idea, very handy tool. It quickened the process quite a bit. But back in when the ERCB came up with their new Directive 56, and they had established that if a well has any trace of H2S, whether it's 1 part per million, 5 parts per million, 1,000 parts per million, it is considered sour. So that when that happened, it sort of nullified the relevance of those CAPP maps. So you will not see reference to those maps in this new version. There has been some elaboration of search area requirements. This is a major area of confusion for the industry. Just looking at some nodding heads right now, in fact. There's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of gray area around what is required in terms of a search area, and understandably so. From a regulator's perspective, it's very hard to build rules around all the different permutations of what is necessary in what areas, in what types of wells, how far are you going to have to search, what data do you need to consider. It's a moving target every time. But from the industry's perspective, it's very hard to then have the confidence that you can be ERCB compliant when there's so much subjectivity around the search area requirements. So I would say that the CAPP guidelines have done a great job in putting better clarity to this. There's still a little bit of subjectivity, understandably, but they've done a great job in elaborating what is necessary in what situations. So we are going to talk a lot more about this when we get to section 3. The EPZ calculations, for those who are aware, Directive 71 has taken over the calculation of an EPZ, so therefore the old guidelines actually did lay out exactly what is necessary to come up with an emergency planning zone. But since those Directive 71 guidelines came out, they've basically taken over that task. There are some other guideline changes. I'm not going to touch on them, not because they're not relevant, but just simply it's pretty self-explanatory, so my speaking to them isn't really necessary. So back to the introduction section, though, a couple other points that are being made that I want to touch on. This statement here, it is the user's responsibility to determine the appropriate level of analysis required for each specific application. This is an important one because what they're essentially saying is know what you're getting into ahead of time. Consider these three factors when you're judging the level of expertise required. So are you going to need to throw a team of 3 engineers on every single well that you're ever going to drill and prepare a 75-page audit package for every single well? Not necessarily. So I appreciate CAPP's recognition to this element, which is, certainly in sensitive areas, if you've got residents within a potential EPZ, if your well is within 5 kilometers of an urban density, or the well is just critically sour, certainly bring out the fine-tooth comb, get out the magnifying glass, and pay a lot of attention to that particular well. But if you're drilling off in no man's land, do you really need to pour thousands of dollars into an H2S release rate assessment when it's not entirely necessary? So it is a consideration to take note of. They also mentioned the need for an EPZ member to supervise and sign off on an H2S release rate assessment. A quick note on that, though, does that mean that an EPZ member has to do all of the work? Not necessarily. A lot of our power users of the H2S search and those who are doing most of the work aren't actually engineers. It's simply an understanding of the data, an understanding of where issues may arise, and being able to vet through and sort through that information. It is necessary, again, that an EPZ member is supervising and signing off. So if a drilling tech is doing a lot of that work and documenting their work, passing it along to the engineer, that is a common workflow.